Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our mid-year briefing. I hope you all enjoyed what was our first keynote speaker. I think Roy Austin, I'm sure that everyone believes and understands and has full confidence that he not only did a phenomenal job, but it was a thought-provoking discussion. He spoke to what coincidentally are the themes of our event, which is data access, partnerships, and improving the operational mission. Our next panel will not disappoint as well. There are an extraordinary group of individuals that not only have been true friends to the IGES community, to their individual domains and practices, but to each of the initiatives and events that we bring together. We have what are three individuals that will provide you not only an informative discussion, a dynamic effort, and a thought-provoking result. And I say this because our prep session should have truly been taped. It was one that we would have loved to have been able to air because each of the practitioners were able to jump into each other's thoughts, tag off of each other's lines, continue the examples that they have within their individual jurisdictions, and truly provide expert balance and value from their perspectives. So let me introduce you to our speakers today. We have Kevin Bowling, whose title currently is Court Administrator for the 20th Judicial Circuit Court out of Ottawa County, Michigan. He is not only a past president of the National Association for Court Management, but he also currently chairs what is the committee, the Global Committee, which is a federal advisory committee to the Attorney General. Our second speaker is Judge Barbara Mack. She is a retired judge from King County Superior Court in Washington State. She is the secretary of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and she too serves on the Global Advisory Committee. And our last panel participant is yet another true friend of the IGES community, Mr. Mike Bell. He is CTO for the Houston Police Department. He formerly served as a CIO for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and he is a member of our CJUS community and also a global supporter. I say this all to bring together the many communities and practices that we individually and we as an organization represent. Our experiences are not only from our day jobs, but our past jobs and the committees that we serve and support. And the picture that we are able to then present is far richer, far more comprehensive than others that are able to speak to these issues. So to that end, I'm going to toss the virtual baton over to Kevin to start off the discussion. There's a couple of questions I'll ultimately pose, but Kevin, I'm going to pass the speaker over to you and let you begin what is going to be a great discussion.
All right. Thank you very much, Maria, and good morning, everyone. And thanks to the IGES Institute for providing this opportunity for us to come together and have this conversation. I assume many of you had a chance to listen in to Roy Austin a little bit earlier this morning with the keynote, and it seemed like many of the themes that he addressed during his comments are certainly what we're going to talk about a little bit as well in this panel. I think we're all familiar with the great work of IGES and the several justice system verticals that they support, including law enforcement and courts, corrections, probation, and we appreciate the efforts that they've made to bring us these opportunities to talk in the various briefings about some of these issues. This morning, our panel's been asked to reflect on what is justice reform, and specifically looking at operational challenges and practitioner perspectives. When I first thought about this and had an opportunity to talk with the other panelists, as I mentioned to them, my first thought was to focus on a new conversation in judicial administration circles that references courts as a service. Oftentimes, there are those of us that have historically been involved in the justice sector, we've thought about courts as a building, someplace we go to. And what we're seeing more and more now, especially throughout the pandemic over the last year and a half or so is that we have to start thinking about courts less as a place and more as a set of services that allows for the proper administration of justice and for a fair, efficient, and accountable method of resolving legal disputes. And this is especially true from a technology point of view because many of the innovators that are involved with the IJUS Institute, I think, can really be helpful to the court world in terms of how we can do a better job of this. I also thought about some of the many lessons learned during the pandemic, including our ability in the court world to pivot quickly. So as some commentators have mentioned, we didn't waste a good crisis. In this sense, we really needed to start reimagining our courts with the renewed focus on how we could better serve people where they were rather than expecting them to come to us all the time. This has an effect on the justice community overall. It has an effect on public trust and confidence in our public institutions, including the courts. And I think it ties back, in a sense, to some of the comments that were made earlier by Roy Austin dealing with good data and our reliance on good data to be able to serve the needs of the people coming into the judicial system. I couldn't help but jot it down when he was talking and noted that he said horrible data leads to horrible results. And that couldn't be any more true than in the court world, where we certainly don't want judges put in the position where they don't have right, accurate, timely data so that they can make the best possible results. We also talked a little bit as we thought about what is justice reform and some of the challenges we looked at about the ability of courts to really pivot to virtual hearings. This was an astonishing move in our world. I've had many folks comment to me about the fact that we did more in a matter of a couple of weeks than all of the committee meetings and papers and conversations did for the past 30 years in terms of bringing technology into the court world and allowing us to nimbly move forward and be able to keep the decision process going. There are a number of states now that are reflecting back on that process in the court system and beginning to publish papers on lessons learned so that we can really understand what happened, how it happened, and perhaps look at what we can do better going forward. I know in my home state in Michigan, just as of April of this year, we had logged over 3 million hours of Zoom hearings in the state of Michigan, and being able to bring those remote options to the public and to other partners in the justice system are incredibly important. Among those lessons learned, we learned that most hearings can be virtual, that most people can connect through the internet, that virtual is more convenient for many attorneys and parties, even though it's not always more convenient for the courts. And there are a lot of judges that have been frustrated by the process because of some of the difficulties with audio and video connections. And I smile as I say that because as I'm talking, I just had a pop-up saying my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully you'll be able to continue hearing this. But courts are looking for newer and more flexible technology. We need to continue to be nimble as we go forward. And this is really one of the areas where the IJUS Institute members can help us out quite a bit. And I encourage you not to wait for the courts as customers to ask for what we need, because sometimes we don't know what we need. I think it is incumbent on many of the IJUS members to reach out to the courts and say, here's what's available. And here's what we can do to do a better job to continue moving this effort forward of making sure that the justice system is more accessible to the people. There's also, as Maria touched on a little bit earlier, both Judge Mack and I are actively involved in the Global Advisory Committee. And in that effort, we're all about information sharing, trying to figure out better ways to connect with each other in partnerships across the various justice verticals and be able to do a better job collaborating, building partnerships, and sharing information as much as we can. So those are just a few reflections from my perspective as a court administrator on what we can do. And I'm going to pass the baton to Judge Mack next, who's going to talk a little bit more from a judicial perspective.
Thank you. And I'm going to pick up where you started with the comments of Mr. Austin. And I also want to thank IJUS for having me. I am clearly the non-techno fish out of water in this gathering. So I particularly appreciate being able to give you my perspective. Justice system data, I'm quoting here, is horrible, unacceptable. It's late, inaccurate, indecipherable, and we can't do the things Kevin talked about a minute ago without having good data. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. I'm going to be fairly specific. Our State Gender and Justice Commission recently commissioned a rewrite of the 1989 study about justice in the courts. The new study covers a lot of the things that Mr. Austin and we are all talking about here. It's broader than gender. It includes topics at the intersection of gender, race, poverty, other identities, and how they work within or without the courts to affect outcomes. I don't need to tell you that in 1989, all court records, all social service records, all public health records, remember those files that had your healthcare records in them in the doctor's offices? Everything was hard copy. Everything was in paper files. We began making our court records electronic in 2000, and they've been, and we were pretty early in King County. In rewriting this commission report, there are 26 or 27 sections, and every single section recommendation discussed and talked about the need for data and data sharing, every single one. And they were on the issues that Mr. Austin listed, among others. I think it's really important for us to distinguish two different reasons and uses for data. We need data to get numbers and demographics that tell us the scope of the problem, that inform policy, and that help us deal with institutional bias, among other things. The second is, and I'll come back to it, we need data for people in law enforcement, public health, courts, other public and private institutions to be able to do their job, and that data needs to be able to be shared. Going back to the big picture, we need data, and I'm going to talk about the thing I am most involved in, which is human trafficking. We need data on those who are sexually exploited and their exploiters, including traffickers and buyers. We have wildly varying estimates of the scope of domestic child sex trafficking and even varying definitions. Does it include online grooming and recruitment? Does it include familial trafficking? Does it include child pornography? What the heck does it include? It's defined differently from state to state and state to feds. We have good data in King County because our prosecutor is determined to keep it. So we know the gender, race, ethnicity, identity of victims and exploiters. We know the education level of buyers. We know what sector of the economy they work in, but no one else in our state or probably in the country has that level of detail in the data. So the question really is, how do you develop policies and laws to protect kids and other vulnerable people if we don't know the scope of the problem, where they come from, who's abusing them, and what they need? This is a cross-system problem. There are many agencies that keep data, but the numbers don't make sense. This came out of our study. Ethnicity, and I'm sure you've seen it too. Ethnicity is often confused with race. So you can't be listed as both Latino and Black or Latino and white. You're just Latino, which leaves out, or you're just Black, which leaves out Latino. That's confusing, it's inaccurate, and it results in inaccurate information going to courts and state institutions about what the situation is. Asian Pacific Islander and Asian are used interchangeably. In some cases, in our study in various parts, gender couldn't be combined with race. The agency in Washington that collects and reports to the legislature on convictions relies on judgment and sentence forms to put those together. In my state, different counties use different forms. So they have different check boxes. And they determine race in different ways. And if they don't have a checkbox on the database, they recharacterize it. You can't get good data about what's happening in your state or the country that way. They might report to the legislature, for example, that there aren't many Latinx people in prison, but that's because they don't let people be characterized as Latino and Black. Okay, and moving on to the second category, the detailed, the data that law enforcement, public health, and others need to do their job. We can have a child in the child welfare system in Washington who was trafficked to Nevada, something I saw frequently when I was in juvenile court, is arrested in another state for stealing something at a grocery store, ends up in a hospital in another state because, or in a drug treatment program because they've been trafficked there and have all the usual problems. And none of the states know about the data that the other states have because it's public health on the one hand, law enforcement on the other hand, the courts, all these different systems that don't talk to each other. So they may not talk to each other within the state because public health and other systems don't necessarily talk to each other. And child welfare and law enforcement don't always talk to each other. And in interstate, there's very little interoperability of those systems. It is not in the interest of children to have systems like this. So that's my sort of top-down view of the need for data. And, you know, it's very frustrating to be looking at these issues from a judicial training standpoint, and I do a lot of that. And you talk about these issues and you can't really talk about the scope of the issues, and you talk about what needs to be done, but we don't have databases that talk to each other. They either can't or they won't for various reasons. And here's another example of things that need to be done, but I don't know why they weren't done. The 2008 Protect Our Children Act mandated establishment of a centralized federal, state, local, tribal deconfliction database to deconflict when targets move from platform to prevent duplication of effort. 13 years later, it doesn't exist. Why not? I mean, I'm a judge. I don't know why not, but I know it's something that everybody needs in order to deal with these issues. I've said my piece. I will pass the baton to Mike Bell.
Well, thanks, Judge Mack. We appreciate your comments, and you know, you're a hard act to follow because you do identify from a very good perspective some of the challenges that practitioners face every day. I don't know why that database wasn't built either, but I would imagine it's somehow related to funding. That seems to be my experience, but I want to go back to kind of what Kevin started at the top of it. We're talking about data quality. I've been in government IT for a long time, and nobody has ever given me an acceptable error rate, right? If the expectation is that there are 0 errors in the data, then we're not funded properly at all. I've had counties when I was in corrections, send me convicted offenders under the wrong name. I've had them list the wrong crime that they were convicted for. And then later that turned out to be a major issue. We've also had some data elements that we thought would never change in our programs that now change quite frequently. Gender. You used to only have 2 choices in the gender box. So that data from, whenever that time period was, hasn't kept up with today's expectations. You may have been convicted as a white male in 1992, but now you're presenting yourself as a white female. So how does that jive with your court records or your criminal history? There's a lot of challenges that are happening today that are, I think, hindering justice reform, which is the topic of this conference. Judge, talking about the juveniles, my heart goes out to you because we're actively involved at the Houston Police Department in fighting the trafficking problem. And Houston was identified as one of the major cities in the United States that had a huge trafficking problem. But as you know, the laws around juveniles are different. The laws that protect juvenile data are very, very strict. And so our ability to share juvenile data is highly scrutinized. And so, I'd also tell you that many states don't agree on what the definition of a juvenile is. And we talked about this in our pre-conference session. So that makes it difficult for us to decide, what does this data mean, which is what you're trying to get to, is how do I analyze this data? And so we say the data is not good. I would tell you the data is good, but it's only as good as the data definitions that were created at the time the data was entered. They're only as good as the acceptable error rate of the people who entered it. And then they're only as good as the rules that allow us to access it. And that's the last part I think that we've got to solve, is who has the ability to access this data, and can we make it more readily available? We were involved in a big project here at the Houston Police Department, sponsored by a group called My Brother's Keeper, where they wanted access to a lot of demographical data about young men of color to try and figure out what are some of the causal factors for their high incarceration rates. Great project with a lot of funding and backing behind it. It failed in the Houston area because we couldn't get past some of the security requirements around the data. And the one that surprised me the most was the school districts. They were the ones that ultimately said, we can't share this data with you. We got past courts, we got past law enforcement, we got past the health, HIPAA, all kinds of privacy rules, but we couldn't get past FERPA. So I think that's another area, Judge, just to be candid, that we've got to focus on if we really want to look at these individuals that are participating in the justice system holistically. I agree with your ethnicity and your race comments, but we've got to give good definitions to the practitioners in the field who are collecting the data, because I have Latinos who present to me as blue-eyed, blonde-haired individuals that don't fit the normal appearance of a Latino. And if they don't self-identify as a Latino, where's the official record? I don't have access to their birth certificates, and depending on their age, their birth certificate may have been from a time when that data element wasn't collected. So we have a lot of, I think, challenges that we've got to tackle on a lot of fronts. But just from a practitioner standpoint, getting my database to talk to somebody else's database really begins with good data definitions and with an open, candid dialogue about data quality. And if we expect our data to have 0 errors, then we have to fund it in a different manner than we're funding it now. The collection of data, and you got to remember that the average law enforcement organization across the United States has 8 officers. So while I'm at one of the largest police departments in the United States, there are many, many small offices that are performing the same functions, that take custody of an offender, they charge them, they book them into a jail, they collect all the same data elements we do, but with many, many fewer technology resources. And so we've really got to understand what we want to do as a nation. And then lastly, what I'd also share with you is that, as you pointed out, crime crosses state lines. Human traffickers don't care if you're in Nevada or they're in Washington State or they're in Texas. But these state laws are different. So what may be a felony here in Texas may not be a felony in Oklahoma. And I think we're seeing a lot of challenges across that front as to how these offenders or suspects are charged, how those charges are adjudicated, how their sentences are carried out, and then what are the resultant records of that encounter with the criminal justice system. So respectfully to Kevin and I, we want to give you good data, Judge. As one of the originators of data, we want to make sure that we're giving justice the data they need to apply the law equally and fairly. But we've also got a lot of limitations that are imposed on us by the people who define these data elements and by the differences in our state laws. And so with that, I know I opened up another can of worms. I see the judge nodding quite a bit. I'll turn it back over to either Kevin or the judge who want to respond to my comments.
Well, Mike, I was smiling as you're talking because I don't think any of us could have put it any better. You're absolutely right about the differences that we have in ability, and they're often fund driven. And I think many of many IGES members that I've worked with or talked with over the years, some of whom have provided excellent solutions to some of these data exchange or data sharing issues, can't help us out sometimes because we may in the government sector not always have the funding to implement some of these technologies that are currently available. And I think you're right. The more that we have decision makers, policy makers, legislators, and others decrying the fact that our data is substandard, they are going to have to make that additional decision to provide adequate funding so that we can move forward in this area.
So folks, I'm sorry, Judge, go right ahead.
I was going to ask a question. Is there a way to get to some sort of uniform standards in terms of definitions? I mean, that was a really important issue that you raised. And, the definitions changed. How do individual jurisdictions keep up with the changing definitions? How does anybody make that happen?
Judge, you asking that question of Mike? Because if he doesn't have an
Judge,
answer,
I can't help but
Anybody?
It strikes me, Judge, that that's one of the prime things that we have worked on through the Global Advisory Committee in terms of supporting standards. In the chat box, one of the participants gave a shout out to Mike and his comments. Yeah. And mentioned the NEAM standards as one example that I think is a great example of how we can push for standards, push for better data definitions. All of those things will certainly be helpful as we move forward and improve data quality. But I think fundamentally the issue that Mike raised in terms of having the appropriate resources to set things up. Mike, I love your example of large law enforcement agencies versus the average of 8 officers in an office. Courts are in the same world. We've got lots of different sized courts around the state, but I know in Michigan, most of the courts are 1 or 2 judge courts. They're smaller operations. In Texas, where you are, there might be a number of large cities that have large court systems and perhaps good-sized budgets, but there are also a lot of rural courts that are out there that don't have the necessary resources to bring in technology innovators who could really assist us. So you're absolutely right when you say we need to look at another way to resource this whole issue about improving data quality and data availability.
So if I could interject and then
Maria, perhaps that's where you and your
where our IGES community can help. I'm with you, Kevin. And I actually want to tie in a couple of the comments that you're all making. By default, the availability of money or the allocation of money seems to define what our priorities are. And of course, even though it should be the priorities that then is followed by money, unfortunately, the reality is very much what Mike made reference to, that even if he wants to accomplish what might be legislative goals or aspirations or databases that were made reference to by the judge, if he does not have the funding to do so, or if organizations don't have the funding to do so, it cannot happen. It can, however, from a technical solution, from a framework solution, from a data definition solution, be one that certainly IJIS can be a part of solutions that centralize these frameworks and that help from a national perspective promulgate those standards within the tools that come from industry that support the operations, and in turn support the CTOs, the jurisdictions, and most importantly, you as practitioners. What I think is problematic and certainly ties back to several of the discussions that we've had, not only in the past, but even with reference to Roy Austin, is how do we support the changing of policy and or ultimately the changing of culture in order to define data as we know it to be, which is priority, meaning wherever you are, whatever decision you're trying to make, no matter what silo you come from within justice or private sector or industry, data is what drives our decisions. And if we can't get to it easily, if there's no parity in the discussions, if there's no definitions that make sense across jurisdictions and timelines, of course, it causes problems. How can we affect the policy and the culture to understand the value of data so that we can all do our jobs better? And I really pose that to each of you. Kevin Tagg, you're it. You're up. You're in my my view. So I'm going to say Kevin goes first, and then Judge, and then
Okay.
Mike, please.
Well, yeah, Maria, I thank you for the question. I think it's a great one, and in some respects, it ties back to a comment that Roy Austin made in his earlier comments when he indicated that we need to give the right people a seat at the table. We've got to provide folks with a voice in this process to identify what the needs are, how they're going to benefit the different justice sector participants, what is actually needed. And I think, you know, Mike also raised a great point from a policy or legislative standpoint that we've got a number of conflicting laws that create barriers for good data sharing. We may have excellent data, you know, collected well, we may have it defined well, but if we're operating in a balkanized environment where we don't talk to each other, that, you know, sort of defies logic ultimately and makes it more difficult for all of us to do our jobs. So we're going to have to get to that point. I think many of the technologists have provided great solutions, technical solutions to get the job done. But what we've got to focus on are some of the governance issues that still plague us and keep us separated and unable to share appropriate data.
Thank you. Judge
So
Mack?
I don't know if Judge Mack or Mike want to add something.
I would, I completely agree that everything is siloed or balkanized everywhere in our social systems at the moment. And it is very hard for people to, in many cases, to connect outside their silos. So, for example, law enforcement and public health, and some of that information, you know, as you said, we've gotten around HIPAA and it shouldn't affect data sharing with law enforcement, but those sectors still don't sit down together and talk about the problems very often, in my experience. We do about, you know, we have public health and law enforcement talking about child sex trafficking here, but they're not talking about data. They're talking about specific, case-specific issues. And I agree with you, Kevin, we need to get the right people at the table. But I also think there's a broader education issue. We're still going to have people talking to each other about data who work with data when we need to be talking to the folks back in Washington and in state capitals who fund the things we're talking about. So I think that it needs to be a broader discussion than just among ourselves.
Totally agree. Mike?
Yeah, that's why I love I mean, I sit and listen to a former judge tell me her perspective, and it makes a lot of sense. In the courtroom, you rattle me, but here you make a lot of sense. So thank you, Judge Mack.
Thank you.
But also tell you from the practitioner standpoint, and I appreciate the dialogue going both ways, is we've also got to think about those first responders and those mental health professionals that we're now asking to respond to what previously might have been a law enforcement call, right? When we show up, we've got a limited amount of tools as law enforcement. We have procedures we follow. Those may not lead to the outcomes that society wants, but we could also be putting some mental health professionals in danger if they didn't know the criminal history of the person they're responding to. So it goes both ways, Judge Mack, and I know you see that as well. I think the dialogue alone has driven this further than it's been thus far. I see a lot of national conversations, a lot of organizations, I just one of them, but others, law enforcement organizations nationally are talking about these outcomes. And I believe our constituents are expecting this of us now more than ever before. And I think that's been very healthy for both law enforcement, but also for these other organizations that have had resources, but they weren't able to help because it wasn't an area that they were asked to or invited to participate in. And ultimately, we've got to think about our downstream neighbors from law enforcement. Everything we produce has got to go to the DA, the defense attorney, and to the courts. And what we're practically seeing is that that's putting a huge load on us because we're generating a ton of data, body-worn camera footage we're getting from people's iPhones, from Ring and Nest, and just the volume of data we're now dealing with. Forget whether it's good data yet or bad data, Judge Mack. I've just got to protect it, do the chain of custody, and present it in a way that it can be admissible in court so that it can be used to adjudicate a criminal act. So, just there's a ton of things happening right now. I think the right people are involved. I think, Maria, you're right, though. We have to also appeal to our partners at the federal agencies. Look how long it took FBI to get people to comply with NIBRs. I think the gentle persuasion method gets a lot of good dialogue going, but it doesn't move anybody forward unless there's funding purposefully allocated for these changes. And so, I don't want to be the only person talking about money in the room, but like you said, Maria, it seems to indicate where the priorities are is where we put the funding. And so I think at a national level, we have to talk to our lawmakers and to our policymakers about giving these federal agencies the authority that when they do mandate something, they can actually be funded to share that funding with state and local organizations to affect the change that we want, and do it in a time frame that really makes sense. Spending 13 years to build a database and then not getting there, Judge Mack, is frustrating. As a technologist, I know how to build a database. I know how to share data, but I've got a lot of competing interests on our limited funding and with our limited resources. And so, we have to escalate this with the people, the policymakers that are expecting these outcomes from us as practitioners.
We all know that obviously this is a balance between priorities, the associated funding, the currently competing and sometimes conflicting policies, not only on the fed, state, local levels, but even within any one of those entities, right? Sometimes we have old policies that are conflicting with the new ones in a given jurisdiction or state that we dealt with. To that end, I wonder if it's not each and all of our organizations and then our single community to address what needs to be done to advance the cause. So I'm thinking of global. Obviously, Kevin, you made reference to the organization that is fundamental to information sharing. I think this is different than information sharing. I think that this is the value of data, and I don't know if this might not be the opportunity and to shift that paradigm, not to shift the goals and the objectives of the group, because that's still the end mission for the operational representatives, but to shift the message of how this transition should happen for this administration, perhaps, to understand the value of data. Beyond saying it, they need to understand that that needs to be represented in the funding and in the policies and in the centralized programs that we can all contribute to in order to substantiate the value of data. Each of your points, whether Mike's talking about it from a data definition, whether Judge, you're making reference to it because different nomenclature wasn't used months ago, let alone years ago, but you still want to be able to track an individual, or whether, Kevin, we're talking about this at the global table, it goes beyond the technical solutions that we know could happen. And yes, we need funding to do that, but I go back to, I think this is a top-down view. It's a top-down education. It's a top-down policy, and I'll use that term loosely, that needs to re-educate what's important in order to address any improvements in all of these areas. Any thoughts?
I couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we got 1 vote out of 3. Kevin and Mike, are we good?
Well, you've got another vote as well, Maria. I think it makes you make a very valid point here, and perhaps this is something that we can carry forward through the Global Advisory Committee. Interestingly, I've got a leadership call with some of the group later today. I think that yes, it is perfect timing. The other place where I think your organization through IGES has also been very helpful is that in your different sectors, justice sectors, you also have advisory committees that are set up. And I know I've had the pleasure of working with some of your members on the courts advisory committee, and I think I saw Joe Wheeler's name from IGES on the attendee list earlier today, and Joe's ably chaired that committee for some time now. But that the work of those different advisory committees that you have through IGES, and to continuing that conversation in the different verticals within justice. So I would just encourage you to continue that, and hopefully even more of your IGES members will get actively involved in some of those advisory committees, depending on the work they do, because the help support just what we've been talking about here today. So I thank you for your work in that, and for the ability to share that information and that better understanding of the value of data, and how from a technology standpoint, folks like Mike that have that background and expertise can help us move the ball forward.
Thank you. And thank you for the reference to the advisory committee. Certainly we will use this event and these discussions to further that cause through the committees. Thank you. Mike?
I'd just like to thank everybody for their comments and suggestions in the chat box. They're right on point and helpful.
You're exactly right. And if we had more time, I'd get to them, but there's a lot of, it's interesting. There's more comments on how we can get this done as opposed to questions. But either way, Judge, it shows engagement, and it shows support for what are the priorities being dealt. So I'm appreciative. Mike, any comments?
Oh, I agree with top down. Bottom up doesn't work for governance. And so I agree with your comments and the other 2 panelists, but also tell you that the comments in the chat box indicate one of the big reasons why I think IGES is so valuable. We have people among us who are solutions oriented that want to solve these big problems. And I think we just need to continue the dialogue, get it up to all those governance bodies, and try to move it up their priority lists, right? Because together, I think we can solve some of these challenges, especially the ones that have eluded us for decades. We've got to get better outcomes.
That sounds great. Before I thank you all, any parting comments, any recommendations?
Just thank you.
All right.
Up to good work.
I thank you all very sincerely for participating in this panel, for your valuable contribution, for what I would like to think is continued support in the future with regard to this specific topic, because I'd really like to have us meet in the future and be able to move on this in any number of ways. So I thank you all, and I thank you to our participants for your contributions to the discussion. And I would ask you to return again at 12:30 for another keynote speaker on a similar topic. But thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees.
Thanks, Maria.
Take care all. Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye now.